2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 winner later. The following day. Meanwhile, later. Just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning. Montage. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. Flashback. End of flashback. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. Several days later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile, Meanwhile,
5,000 celebrities later.
one little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 million years later.
The next morning. Later that night. The next evening. One operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many, many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. The next morning. The next morning. Many frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 1 day later. One humongous meal later. A little while later. Later that night. One entree later. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Several bouquets later. 10 hours later. 80 minutes later. Many memories later. 1 week later. Happy friendiversary.
Later.
Later. Many, many unbearable moments later. The next morning. Many adorable hours later. Several days later. Much later. 1 week later. One beautiful Christmas morning later. Many versions later. 1 week later. Many meeps later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. Not much later. 9 hours later. Many hours of fun time later. 1 minute later. Later that day. Many chilly hours later. The next day. 1 full day of fatherly fun later. 1 week later. The next day. The next morning. Like every morning. The very next day. The next morning. 1 minute later. The next morning. The next morning. 1 week later. 2 idiots later. Later still. More laterer. The next morning. The next day in a parallel universe. The next day. The next day. 1 week later. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many forks later. The next day. 1 nanosecond later. Many disorderly days later. 10 minutes later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Limited time only. 15 minutes later. A few hours later. Much later. A little later. 12 seconds later. 3 annoying songs later. A very boring walk later. 1 scary road later. Spoiler alert. A few seconds later. 1 loading screen later. 1 loading screen later. 47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. Many moments later. Many moments later. An eternity later. An eternity later. A few moments later. 1,000 years later. A little longer than a few moments later. Meanwhile, you are an idiot. 365 days later. Just then.
2,000 centuries later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Later that morning. Meanwhile, at the race car time.
1 whole day later. The Patrick and SpongeBob running by Yoshi and finally episode The SpongeBob SquarePants. The end. 1 death later. 1 death later.
So 1 death later that the old narrator got tired of waiting, and they had to hire a new one.
See next day in a parallel universe. 2,000 years earlier. By sheer coincidence. 1 beautiful Gary's voice later.
A few nanoseconds later.
Hey, announcer there.
Yes, French narrator.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
10 minutes later.
Would you stop imitating me again? It is starting to get very annoying. An hour later. Soon after. again. Several hours of Boeing Samsung Galaxy S for later. Many peaceful hours later. 372 new lows later. Later that Thursday. 1 wishes later. See next day. 1 plan to nap later. 1 feeling weak later. Soon after. With 4 to 6 really imitate weeks. Many worst idiots later. Meanwhile still. Even more meanwhile. The next evening.
1 second later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few will fit you moments later. Meanwhile at the Errors Picture Studios. Many months of making a new later. Many months of making a new studio later. Many months of making a new house later. Many months of making a new show later. Later that same days. Later that disco night party. 928 seconds later. 2,763 miles later. Later that Wolfie is going to the Errors Pictures' house and Agent Santos and Agent Archano were going to the work. Later, at the P-Head Market, back at the original location.
7 minutes later, another week later, today, 4 days later, limited time only again, previously again, meanwhile, at the robot line. Later, at today very boring then approximately 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion, paranoia, billion years later. 7 weeks later, 9 weeks later, many days later, 4 hours later, 1 hour and 39 minutes later,
50 seconds later. 200 minutes later. A few seconds later. 5.5 minutes later. 8 minutes later. 17 minutes later. 24 minutes later. 8.5 minutes later. 23 seconds later. 1.5 minutes later.
meanwhile, 9 books later, happy 2nd anniversary. 12 months later,
Sometime later.
9 unbearable hours later, you win the idea. Several hours later,
Approximately 9 minutes later. Later that tomorrow. 7 very boring days later. 3 minutes later. Many moments later. A few weeks later.
a few months later,
7 hours and 7 weeks later.
25 years later, 11 hours later, the next Friday, 6 to 8 hours later, 8 to 12 minutes later, 3 to 5.5 moments later, several scary minutes later, a little longer than a few weeks later, the next week, 4 minutes later, several tic-tacs later, a little longer than a few seconds later, several weeks later, the following Monday, 9 more days later, several years later, a few flowers later, several weekends later, a little longer than a few inches later, 3 minutes later, more hours later, a few moments later, 5 weeks later, the next night, a little longer than a few pants later, day 5, day 6, day 7, 7 to 9 hours later, 9 to 11 months later, 6.5 minutes later, a little longer than a few days later, 2,000 hours later, 8.5 inches later, 35 weeks later, 4 seconds later, 5 seconds later,
15 seconds later. 40 inventions later. A ton of weeks later. Many, many weeks later. 200 minutes later. Many unbearable minutes later. 60 minutes later. 4,000 centuries later. 2 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, when it's still going.
meanwhile still,
Day 5. 4 hours later. 11 hours later. Later that morning. Several good later. 15 seconds later. 30 seconds later. A few nanoseconds later. 2 operations later. 8 months later. 242 explosions later. 164 kilometers later. 1 shift later. 8 hours later. A few days later. 13 minutes later. 45 minutes later. Much later. 5 weeks later. Later that afternoon. Later that day in a parallel universe. 3 hours later again. 1 hour later again. 1 second later. 80,000 impressions later. 47 more seconds later. 4,000 years later. The next morning. The very next morning. Really the next morning. 10 dab to societies later. 60 operations later. An unbelievable performance moments later. Meanwhile, back in the 298 frozen patties later. Many minutes later again. 4 semesters later. 15 winners later. 1 millisecond later. 1 microsecond later.
Many VR plays later.
Would you stop imitating me again? It is starting to get very annoying.
So please, just quit the old one and link is in the description for the new one. And now it's like burning in hell, you know.
365 days later.
분신사바, 분신사바, 오이테 쿠다사이.
After finishing food.
2,000-ish years later.
Many buckets later!
14 hours later. Days later. Meanwhile, many repressed memories later. The next morning. 1 nap later. 24 sleepless hours later. Several days later. 1 journey through space later. Much tranquility later. Many invitations later. 6 to 8 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 1 hour later. Many hours later. Several hard-hitting hours later.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
The next day. 1 a while later.